Hello, happy Tuesday. Welcome back to another episode of The Practice. This show is a look into my digital art workflow. I'm Stuart. I'm a 3D artist, illustrator, designer, and your pal, and I'm excited to have you back again this week. More typographic fun in the world of The Practice on this fine Tuesday. I guess that makes it 4 weeks straight, a month straight of typography. Who knows what we'll be up to next week, but certainly been enjoying this little riff on a theme. On the heels of last week, when we had fairly simple type with a lot going on around it, this week I wanted to sort of reverse that and have, fairly simple background and areas surrounding the type, and really push all that crazy little detail inside the letters. So you see we're starting with a combination of typography here, and I'm setting up a really simple, clean background that I'm going to use a Boolean object to sort of remove the volume of those letters from. And then I was inspired by sort of, biochemistry and the little algae and flora and the tiny little creatures that would live in a pond and a drop of pond water, something like that. The cool little unicellular eukaryotes and different things that you might see when looking into a microscope. And so I decided to include those inside the letter forms, the word hidden. First here, I'm getting a nice sort of curving arc to these letters and trying to do them by hand, but it's not very neat. I'm not loving the way it's coming out, so I sort of shift my approach here and decide to use a bend deformer. These are kind of annoying to position sometimes. They don't always make perfect sense. But once you do get it sort of positioned, and that new fit to parent option is super, super useful, as you can imagine. And what you have to do is you have to curve it a certain increment and then reposition it half as much as that bend to keep its position level. Right? So see that pushes it all the way down, so then I have to rotate it a little bit. So there, if I rotate it 30 degrees, then I have to rotate. If I bend it 30 degrees, then I have to rotate the whole object back 15 degrees to keep it even. So I prefer to use nice round increments when I'm bending the object. So I know, especially with typography, it's nice to get everything nice and centered. And that's really what I do to create that volume, that opening in this simple backdrop cube. And then the fun, but perhaps slightly longer and more tedious process of creating little algae and bacteria and plants and stuff like that to add into these letters. And as I frequently do, I start with just blocking out geometric sections of the composition with things like spheres and capsules and stuff like that. Really the early going of setting things up. I have to say I'm a lot happier with the way this ultimately turned out as compared to last week's episode. I know last week's episode we really went on a diatribe and we talked much less about the actual process of creating a piece. And we talked a lot more about the thought process that goes behind maintaining a consistent and positive creative practice, and how sometimes, it's not always perfect. And this week, I was pretty pleased with the outcome. Of course, it could have improved in different ways, in certain ways. I think, it's really these are just kind of exercises in creativity. I don't intend any of these to be perfect, polished, 100% finished pieces. And I'm always throwing that caveat out there. So here we're modeling a little plant. Very simple geometric things. I know it seems rather simple, but I have this pulled out into its own scene now. But if you're thinking about it in context with everything else that's going on in the scene, it's going to be quite small. So we don't need to build in that much detail. And I wanted everything to be sort of simplified, representative abstractions. Just dropping down the poly count on some of those items and throwing it into the composition. So you see here, it's quite small. in the composition. And we're going to be making copies of these and repositioning them and breaking the boundaries of the letters up a little bit too, having some of these items sort of growing out of the letter forms. I frequently do that when adding an element. I add one on one side of the composition and a similar one to the other. And those, it's funny, it's one of my early sort of ticks in setting up a composition. I do it in that way quite frequently, actually. What I'm also doing is a lot of these objects that I'm adding, I'm rotating gently to match the angle of the letters that they sit inside of. There's this sort of arcing, like typically when you work with type, the forms have lots of parallel lines. Like so the I and the D would have lines that don't ever converge. They'd be totally parallel. But what's cool with this is we have sort of this gentle arc, and the strokes of the letter forms that would typically run directly up and down don't. And so when adding in perfectly straight elements, to my eye, they felt a little bit disjointed to leave them running 90 degrees up and down. So what I did was just gently arc them so that they seem to match that flow of the letter form. Adding in a little landscape here, a very shallow, kind of bumpy landscape. It's a bit of a ground. It helps break up some of the geometric forms of the letters and get you really more of an organic kind of shape. The inside. Here I decided to make the letter forms themselves a bit deeper, and I wound up punching all the way through the back of that cube, so I had to make that deeper as well. And unfortunately, while I was recording this, I think I stopped to grab another cup of coffee or to use the restroom or something like that, and forgot to turn the record button back on for a while. The good news is, though, the only parts of the recording we missed were some of the nitty-gritty details of just adding and moving around plants, sort of like what we're doing now. So you guys really didn't miss too much, and that actually makes for a slower-paced time-lapse effect. So that this episode is the normal length that it would be typically, but there's a little bit less footage going into that, and you can see that the record speed isn't quite as high as it typically is. People often will ask for recordings that are a little bit slower, which I should mention, it's always possible to slow down in YouTube, to slow down the speed of a recording just by hitting the video settings, the little gear icon in the lower corner, and you can set the playback speed to 0.25, which is a quarter speed, which is usually about the speed of the actual footage itself. Has if it weren't sped up. So there you have it. Now I'm just working on setting up some basic lighting. I don't, since I had ambient occlusion turned on, the interior areas of those letters tended to be really, really dark. So I spent a lot of time turning the gamma up and adjusting the darkness of the lower end gradient in the ambient occlusion channel, and just trying to make sure that the light was bouncing deep enough into those recesses to read nicely. Still, even though this is a 3D rendering, I often do want these to have like a nice, clean sort of graphic look to them. Not entirely clean, but yeah, I don't mind if frequently they aren't perfectly realistic, as long as I'm getting the visual effect that I want. I didn't realize this till just now, but it seems that similar to last week's episode, we're going with a fairly simple color palette here. Last week we really just stayed in the orange range. I had this kind of this luminant orange sort of texture, and I just sort of copied it and made a slightly darker version of it. Here we're doing really just two colors, blue and white. There's some slight variation on that, and the shading gives us a little bit of richness in that white. But yeah, really sticking to a rather simple color palette here, which I think works well. And it's fun to take the complexity of these letters, all these little tiny details, and keep those all in one color, which sort of it makes them more harmonious, which is to say that they're not so different from one another so as to be visually distracting. They sit nicely together because they're all the same color. And I think a limited color palette can do that. And here you can see that we've missed a little bit of the process, but here is a much more developed and filled out version of those letters. And we're knocking out a really large rendering here. You can see that the basic intent of the piece is the same. You haven't missed that much, but what we didn't wind up capturing in the recording process was just the slow, painstaking process of adding in some of these additional details. And they're rather simple shapes. It was just about positioning them in a way so as to be visually appealing and composed nicely. So there we have it. Right now, we after we got it pretty much where we liked it, then we cranked the render settings, turned the quality way up, turned the resolution way up, and am kicking out a super large version of this image. Nearly there. And now I was really loving the way the word hidden looked. I liked all the little details. I liked the way the very geometric edges of the letters were broken up by the soft, kind of curving organic forms. I thought that was working really well. I felt that the word life wasn't working that well. And honestly, I felt like it was a little too large. The shadows were a little bit too harsh. And so what I wind up doing here, after I add a little bit of noise to some of the white areas of the rendering, is I wind up just like sort of quickly and in kind of a hacky way, just edited out the word life. And then I added it back in as a flat bit of typography, just right here in Photoshop. I thought that, the word hidden had this kind of uniform, white, textured sort of look, and it was working really well. And the word life it felt too disparate. It wasn't working for me. And I guess this is another way that this week's episode relates to last, is that sometimes you gotta make a big change, even though it's pretty deep into the process of creating the piece. So, I looked at this for a while and decided I just didn't like it, even though it had been around for a while. So we got rid of it. The next minute or so here is me kind of making a mess of that, to be honest. There's probably better ways to have done this. And I had a bunch of layer masks set up already, and I think they were kind of confusing me. So I used the content aware tool to get rid of most of it, and it created this strange sort of beveling effect. So I'm painting over that, some nice soft shapes. I'm going to eventually get it out of there, which, there we go, that's close enough. And here we go, life. And what font was that again? Let's go check. There it is. See, this time I'm making it a bit smaller, and since it doesn't have those shadows and that dimension, it recedes back into the hierarchy of what you look at in the image. You see the comparison there. It's smaller and it's less contrasty and it's less distracting. And that's what I wanted. So I had just a very, very, very subtle shadow to it. Hardly visible at all. And that's starting to feel pretty good. So if you like this video, if you found it useful, please share it with a pal and hit the like and subscribe button below. If you want to keep up with me and the work that I'm doing, hit me up on DLGNCE on Instagram and Twitter. And until next week, thanks so much for stopping by. See ya.